The lights in the Olaris Medical Station's infirmary were made to feel like a peaceful sunrise. Soft amber tones meant to calm recovering patients. But that comfort didn't reach the shirtless man sitting on the diagnostic platform. 6 scars marked his torso. 3 were long and jagged. 1 was a neat circle, clearly from surgery. The other 2 were short, raised, and stretched like worn seams in cloth. Dr. Trinath stood by the scanner, studying the data. Tall and thin, with eyes built for precision, his species had evolved past scarring. Their skin healed cleanly, without leaving a trace. But this human, Thomas Riggs, wore his past openly, like badges. "There's no medical reason your body should still have these scars," Trinath said, tilting his head. "These injuries are decades old, yet your skin remains marked." Thomas looked up. He had a mess of brown hair and the relaxed posture of someone too tired to feign discomfort. "Yeah, that's normal for us. But the healing is incomplete. The collagen alignment is chaotic. Your dermis rebuilt itself without structural order." "That's what a scar is," Thomas said. "It's not about order. It's about patching things up and moving on." "I don't understand. Your species is capable of rapid recovery. Why maintain evidence of prior damage?" Thomas glanced at his side, where a gnarled, inch-long line crossed his ribs. "That one's from a motorbike accident when I was 19. Spent 3 days in the hospital. My brother shaved my head while I was doped up." Trinath blinked. "You permit such markings to remain as records?" Thomas shrugged. "We scar so we remember where we got stronger." There was a pause. The alien's tendrils retracted slightly in contemplation. "That is not physiologically necessary." "Nope, it's psychological." Renath made a note in his pad. "Human dermal scarring. Inefficient. Possible secondary function as mnemonic or symbolic reinforcement. Hypothesis: structural imperfection may indicate psychological resilience." Still, he found it difficult to accept. They had brought Thomas to Olaris Station 3 weeks ago after a supply vessel reported that one of the crew had been injured during a planetary survey. A snapped harness line had sent Thomas tumbling down a rock face. He broke his forearm in 2 places and suffered deep lacerations to his back and thigh. The bleeding had been controlled, the bone reset, tissue regrowth initiated with low-grade synth gel. But it was the older scars, not the new ones, that drew the alien doctor's attention. He approached with a dermal scanner, hovering over Thomas's chest. "This," Trinath said, pointing to a faded scar below the clavicle. "Surgical?" "Yaha. Appendix." "And here, the right forearm?" "Cut through a fence trying to rescue a dog. She bit me too. Got the scar to remember both parts." Trinath recorded each entry. "So every scar has meaning." "Usually. Some people don't like theirs. I keep mine. But it serves no biological purpose." Thomas tapped his temple. "Not here. Here." That night, Trinath reviewed regenerative research on 28 sapient species. None allowed natural scarring. Even the less developed species had topical compounds or gene patches to smooth tissue regrowth. Humans were the anomaly. He dug deeper into archived trauma studies. Earth physicians had long treated scars as cosmetic defects, lasers, skin grafts, dermabrasion, but many patients refused correction. Some even had their scars intentionally preserved or enhanced. He watched a documentary from Earth. A soldier, post-separation, declined further revision surgery. "It reminds me I made it home," she said. Trinath leaned back, deeply unsettled. The next morning, Thomas was already awake when he entered the lab. "Did you sleep?" Trinath asked. 4 hours, more than usual." "You appear restless." Thomas rolled a shoulder. "Pain's better today, still sore." The scanner confirmed it. The arm was healing cleanly. No signs of infection or misalignment. The deep tissue repair was even ahead of schedule. "You'll have a scar on the shoulder," Trinath said. "Unless we treat it further." Thomas hesitated. "Let it scar." "You would prefer that?" "Yeah." even though I can prevent it? Thomas gave a faint smile. It's mine. I earned it. Trinath moved back, unsure how to respond. Do you consider yourself improved by the wounds? Not by the wounds, Thomas said, by surviving them. Later that week, Trinath escorted Thomas to the physical therapy wing. The man was slow but steady, bracing on the rails, pushing through the stiffness of healing. The scar from the thigh gash had already begun to form. Red raised a line across new skin. Another patient, a Heskari, floated past in a hover brace. She'd had her wings regrown in a surgical cocoon. No trace of her injury remained. She looked at Thomas curiously. Why do you let yourself stay marked? Because some of us need to see what we've been through. The Heskari said nothing more. Trinath spent that evening pacing in his lab. His species had erased all traces of physical trauma for generations. Pain was addressed at the cellular level. Injury was nothing more than a biological event. But what if the human was right? What if memory lived in the skin? He returned to Thomas the next day with a question. If we removed every scar, would you still remember the injuries? Sure, Thomas said, but I wouldn't feel them. Petrina recorded, human memory potentially reinforced by physical markers. Pain not merely endured, but internalized as formative. Symbolic and structural healing may be intertwined in psychological development. He began to understand, but not fully. It would take one more event to make it real. 5 days later, the emergency sirens wailed through the station, provided the only noise the station. An accident in the maintenance ring. Cryo vault rupture, one technician trapped, acidic vapor burns. Trinath ran to the trauma bay. When he arrived, Thomas was already there, helping lift the injured body onto the table, sleeves soaked in coolant and blood. You are not cleared for duty, Trinath said sharply. I'm cleared to help someone bleeding out, Thomas snapped back. The technician was stabilized. She would recover, but not without damage. Trinath knew their tissue wouldn't regenerate cleanly. She'll scar, he murmured. Thomas looked at him. Then she'll know how strong she was. Later, alone, Trinath opened the comparative dermal models again. This time, he didn't study healing rates. He zoomed in on a high-resolution image of a human scar. The ridges, the mismatched fibers, the visible journey beneath the skin. He traced it with a finger. Not a flaw, a marker, a monument. The technician survived. She left the medbay a week later with bandages lining her left arm and the left side of her neck. Her skin beneath had begun healing, but not cleanly. A ripple of raised tissue where the vapor burn had reached full thickness. Her species, Drivari, was known for regenerative slowdowns after exposure to cryoacid environments. Trinath noticed she avoided the mirror in the hallway. Most of his patients did at first. He did not remark on it. Healing was as much psychological as physiological. That he had started to understand. Thomas was cleared for light duties 2 days after the cryo incident. He returned to the lab wing with a list of restricted activities and a slight limp. The scarring on his thigh had formed into something rough but sealed. It pulled slightly when he moved, but he didn't ask for revision. Instead, he worked quietly, calibrating soil samplers and logging planetary nutrient scans for the next wave of survey missions. Trinath came by during third cycle to observe his movement. Mobility is improved. Thomas adjusted his chair. Pain's manageable. I still feel it when I pivot too fast. Your scan data shows proper vascularization around the scar line. Healing has reached the tertiary stage. Feels like it. Trinath hesitated. I was reviewing ancient Earth surgical protocols before synthetic dermis treatments. Some methods encourage deliberate scar minimization. Yeah, lots of people still try to erase them. Creams, grafts, laser smoothing. Do you approve of that? Depends, Thomas said. Some people don't want to be reminded. Some don't want others to ask. But for me, the scars say I came through something, that I wasn't erased. Trana considered this as he examined the scan. We erase trauma here. I know. In body, at least? Thomas looked at him. You really think you can erase it in the mind? We try. There was a pause, long enough that the diagnostic panel went dark. Thomas folded his arms. What happens when it doesn't work? We medicate, adjust neural pathways, suppress memory intensity. And if the memory is something they need to understand who they are, we have never considered that necessary. Thomas gave a dry laugh. Maybe that's why you don't get the scars. 2 days later, Trinath accompanied the technician, Naila, during her follow-up dermal scan. The injury had stabilized. Her skin, though tougher now, had taken on a distinct sheen. The pigment was different. She looked at it with barely veiled discomfort. You may request cosmetic overlay, Trinath said gently. We have synthetic graft options that match your baseline pigment. Naila stared at her arm. Will it feel the same? It will function the same. I didn't ask about function. Trinath hesitated. It will not be the same, but it will appear close to your original dermis. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. After she left, he found Thomas in the observation bay, watching the gravity tides shift on the moon's surface. Natha asked if the replacement would feel the same, Trinath said quietly. Thomas didn't turn. That's the question, isn't it? Kunath sat beside him, a rare gesture among his kind. I believe I've underestimated your species' tolerance for incomplete healing. We don't tolerate it. We live with it. I watched footage from your planet's conflict zones, medics covered in blood, saving lives with the most rudimentary tools. You call it field surgery. Thomas nodded. Sometimes the best you can do is stop the bleeding, and those wounds become permanent, irreversible. Yeah? Why do I continue to send your kind into danger if the price is permanent damage? Thomas met his gaze. Because some things are worth protecting, and because walking away with scars means you didn't go down. Trinath sat back. Structural imperfection is a mark of honor, or a reminder, or just a sign that we're not invincible. Some people need that. He shifted and winced slightly. You're in pain again, Trinath said. Thomas nodded. Scar tissue pulls when I stretch, especially in dry environments. I can recommend a topical compound to soften the collagen mass. Thomas considered. Yeah, that'd help, but don't erase it. Only comfort, not revision, Trinath confirmed. 3 days later, a minor incident in the biosphere dome cracked open a different understanding. A junior botanist fell from a perch platform and suffered a compound wrist fracture. The human team responded quickly, stabilized her, and brought her to the trauma unit. She was young, 22. Name, Lila, from Oregon. Trinath handled the treatment. She asked if the break would leave a scar. Yes, he said, not unkindly. It will not interfere with function. She nodded, biting her lip. Good. I want it to stay. He blinked. Why? So I don't forget how close I came to falling wrong, and so I don't let the fear of it keep me from climbing again. After she left, Trinath added to his notes. Psychological frameworks in humans actively integrate structural trauma into future behavioral patterns. Fear of repetition does not lead to rejection of risk, but to contextualized learning. The scar is both consequence and caution. Thomas read the entry over his shoulder. Told you, they're maps. Later, Trinath reviewed older medical records from human crew members across the station. Scars from childhood mishaps, sports injuries, military service. Some were documented with photos and personal annotations. One had a journal attached. 3 inches, left calf running from a fire. Still dream about the heat. But I outran it. He opened a separate file and looked at the photo again. Thomas's left forearm. The fence cut. The faded crescent tooth mark near the wrist. Got the scar to remember both parts, Thomas had said. The injury and the rescue. Days passed. Trinath requested human case studies from the Central Earth Archives. He read about patients who chose to keep facial scars, burn patterns, surgical lines. One man, an amputee, had tattoos inked around his residual limb, not to hide the loss, but to claim it. There was a phrase repeated often among the notes. Earned. The next morning, Thomas was back in physical therapy. He'd reached full stride again, the limp all but gone. The scar on his thigh shone slightly under the lights, still new but settled. Nayla stood beside the door, watching. When Thomas sat for a water break, she approached. "You don't mind people seeing it?" He looked at her. "The scar? Yeah. No. Why would I?" She pulled back her sleeve. The burn on her arm was more pronounced now. Smooth, shiny, alien. Different from her other skin. "I haven't looked at it much." Tomas smiled gently. "It's part of you now." "Feels like it doesn't belong. Give it time." Trinath, watching from the glass beyond, made a final note that night. Human dermal scarring appears to represent a complex psychological mechanism, not a flaw, but a feature of identity, a topography of experience, imperfection as a form of truth. Then he did something unprecedented. He made the report public. Cross-species, open access. He titled it On Scars and Strength, Understanding the Human Preference for Incomplete Healing. And deep within, as he closed the entry, he wondered. Maybe pain wasn't just something humans survived. Maybe it was something they grew by refusing to forget. The report rippled through the station like a pebble dropped in still water. Trinath hadn't expected debate. The document was clinical, evidence-based, full of statistical correlation and psychological context. But once word got out that a senior xenomedical officer had suggested that scars could be beneficial, intentionally left alone, colleagues responded with everything from curious inquiry to outright disapproval. "Are you suggesting we encourage visible damage?" asked Dr. Sullivan, a regenerative therapy expert from the outer rings. "No," Trinath replied calmly. "Only that we examine what it means to those who carry it." Another scientist from the SARI delegation chimed in. "Your paper implies incomplete healing as a viable emotional tool. That contradicts centuries of tissue restoration science." Trinath didn't argue. He simply directed them to one of the attached case studies. Leela, the young human botanist, now undergoing targeted wrist mobility exercises. Her performance had surpassed recovery benchmarks. Despite permanent ligament tension and residual joint stiffness, her confidence had increased. The panel paused on her final quote from the interview. "Every time I use it, I know I didn't break. Just bent a little." Others weren't so philosophical. At least 3 higher-tier research leads questioned the paper's validity, citing potential cultural bias and human exceptionalism. Trinath listened, acknowledged, and continued updating the report with fresh interviews, physical metrics, and recovery trajectories. He was no longer trying to convince anyone. He was documenting what he now recognized as a truth. For humans, healing was not always about perfection. It was about integration. Thomas, meanwhile, had returned to full duty. The mission to the mineral-rich moon of Salvaris resumed 2 weeks after the report went public. Thomas was assigned to geological sampling in Zone C, a terrain known for uneven footing and frequent thermal shifts. When Trinath questioned the risk, Thomas simply said, "I can move. I'm cleared. If I baby this leg forever, I'll never trust it again." Trinath allowed it, reluctantly. The report had changed him, too, in ways he wasn't quite ready to name. The real test came 3 days later, when an aftershock, common on Salvaris but rarely severe, caused a shelf collapse near Zone C. A rescue team was dispatched within 15 minutes. Thomas had already dug himself out when they arrived. He was limping, blood at his temple, and holding a crewmate's arm across his shoulders. The younger man had a dislocated knee and a deep gash along his thigh. Thomas hadn't waited. He had fashioned a crude pressure dressing, relocated the leg against resistance, and carried the man a quarter click back toward the transport. Chernoth was part of the medical response when they landed. Thomas insisted on walking to the medbay himself. "You are bleeding," Chernoth said sharply. "I've had worse." "I can see that." Thomas smirked, but sat down without argument. The head wound was superficial, a laceration through the scalp, no skull fracture, minimal swelling. He'd need staples, nothing life-threatening. Chernoth applied a local anesthetic and prepped the wound field. "You'll scar," he said plainly. "Figured. You are aware we can reduce that risk. I'm also aware you wrote a whole paper about why we shouldn't always try." Chernoth's hands paused. "So you read it?" "Everyone did. It's the first time anyone up here explained why some of us want to look like we've lived." Chernoth resumed cleaning the wound. "You looked like that already." "Now I look more like it." The staples clicked into place, 6 in total. Clean, efficient. The scar would be small but permanent. Thomas didn't even flinch. After the procedure, Chernoth sat beside him, both watching the blood-stained gauze being disposed of by a sterilization drone. "I do not believe my people could live like yours," Chernoth said. "You with scars?" "With pain, with visible pain." Thomas leaned forward. "You live with pain. You just don't let anyone see it." Chernoth considered that. "We are trained to prevent the externalization of suffering. It is considered undignified. Sometimes dignity is just fear in a tuxedo." "That sounds human." Thomas smiled. "It is." Weeks passed. Lila returned to climbing drills, this time with a wrist brace and renewed speed. Naila declined dermal revision entirely. The burn along her neck remained, though she no longer wore her hair to cover it. More humans began speaking up. Not everyone wanted their scars, but those who kept them did so with purpose. A maintenance officer with a knee scar from a falling crate, a medical assistant who survived childhood surgery and still traced the path with their thumb in nervous moments. Chernoth began hosting voluntary interviews in the medbay annex. He asked each participant the same question: "Why did you keep it?" The answers varied. "To remember the lesson. To remind myself I made it. Because it belongs to my story. Because. Each reason unique. Each reason human." Then one morning, as the station passed into its long dusk rotation, Thomas came in with a new addition. A small scar running diagonally over the knuckle of his right hand. Chernoth raised an eye ridge. "Another?" "Engineering module. Caught it in a pressure hatch, nothing major." "I assume you'll want to keep this one too?" "Honestly," Thomas flexed the hand, "I might get it tattooed around, make it part of something bigger." Chernoth blinked. "Decorating your wounds?" "A bracing them." That night, Chernoth sent a follow-up to his original report, a supplement based on ongoing interviews and physiological scans. The final section was personal reflection. Among humans, a scar is neither a flaw nor simply the memory of injury. It is a marker of becoming. Where the body once broke, the will chose to continue. No synthetic compound can replicate that. He ended it with a line he had once written off as odd. "We scar so we remember where we got stronger." This time, it didn't seem odd at all. The ceremony was informal. No official medals, no broadcast stream. Just a quiet gathering near the Habitat Arboretum, a circle of humans and a handful of other species who had volunteered to attend. At its center, Thomas Riggs stood freshly out of medical restriction, wrists still stiff from the pressure hatch incident, forehead bearing the faint red line of his latest scar. He was being recognized not for bravery, not exactly, but for demonstrating what the committee had described as cross-species adaptive cohesion under duress. In simpler terms, staying on his feet when things got rough and showing others how to do the same. Chernoth stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, his normally sharp eyes unreadable. The human commander, a silver-haired woman with gravel in her voice, stepped forward and presented Thomas with a small, engraved pin, shaped like the Olara station emblem. "You've made it through the worst more than once," she said. You could have left. No one would have blamed you, but you didn't. Thomas accepted the pin with a simple nod. Had too much left to do. There was some quiet clapping, even from species that didn't naturally have hands. Later, after the gathering had dispersed and the corridor lights dimmed for the rest cycle, Thomas found himself back in the medical wing, seated near the long stretch of observation windows. Trinath approached without comment and sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The planet below turned slowly in shadow. A quiet storm curled across its surface. "I reviewed your supplement," Thomas said finally, "the part you added to the paper." Trinath didn't respond right away. Then, "I thought it necessary. The report was incomplete." "You wrote about becoming—" "I did." Thomas shifted. "Never thought a scar would start a cultural conversation." "Nor did I." Silence again, but less heavy this time. Then Thomas rolled up the sleeve of his right arm and held it out. "I don't usually show this one," he said. "Wasn't from something dramatic. Just a stupid mistake during my first deep field job. Sliced myself on old metal while patching a sensor. No heroism, just a bloody mess." Trinath examined the scar. It was pale, older than the others, hidden unless deliberately revealed. "Why did you keep it?" Thomas's gaze drifted toward the stars. "Because I had just started living on my own, paying bills, finding out who I was. That scar isn't about pain. It's about realizing I could take care of myself, even when I was hurt." Trinath considered this, then reached into his own medical satchel and removed a data node. "I've compiled similar narratives, not just human. Since the report was published, others have shared memories of injury that changed them. Not all carry physical scars, but the response was universal. Something altered. Something held on." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You mean the other species?" "Yes. Even the ones that regenerate cleanly? Especially them. They wonder if they've lost something in the process." Thomas gave a low chuckle. "You're telling me scars are becoming popular?" "No, but stories are—" Trinath paused, then said something he never thought he would. "I once ruptured a motor tendon as a youngling. Tripped during academic initiation. The repair was flawless. No sign it ever happened." Thomas looked at him. "Do you remember the pain?" "Yes." "Do you remember what it taught you?" And Trinath's voice was quieter. "To be cautious, but not brave." They sat in silence again. Then Thomas said, "Funny thing about scars. They don't just remind you what happened. They remind you what didn't." Trinath tilted his head. "Explain." "You break your arm and it heals. That scar says, you didn't die, you survived. You got back up. So the next time you fall, it's not as scary. You've already proven you can stand again." "I see." The silence wasn't awkward now, it was thoughtful, shared. When Trinath stood to return to his lab, Thomas asked one last question. "Do you ever regret not having any—" Trinath paused. "I didn't until I started listening." As he left, Thomas remained at the window, gazing down at the planet below. The next morning, during shift change, a low-level comms officer in the medical wing passed by a small workbench where a set of dermal tools were neatly laid out. Among them sat a thin metal sheet, shiny, unused, a scar revision plate. But beside it was something else. A recording tag labeled with the station date and a line of text. "Some of us choose not to erase the pain, some of us grow from it." The comms officer didn't understand the context, but Trinath did. Because when Thomas had declined scar revision one last time, when he walked back into duty with lines across his skin like ancient calligraphy, he had answered a question no alien could phrase. Not, "Why don't you heal completely?" but, "Why do you insist on carrying the story?" And now, so did Trinath. Because humans didn't carry scars as burdens. They carried them as banners. And some banners don't wave unless the wind has tried to knock you down.